Hi, howdy, hello, everyone. This is Tanya, the tour guide, bringing you this week's episode of New Orleans Secret Myths. Just to jump in and start, I want to say thank you to all those who are supporting me and following me. And now to get into one of my passion projects, Vice, the ladies of the red light district. There are cities that hide their sins, and then there is New Orleans. A city that has always understood appetite, city of perfume and rot, a city where piety and pleasure have always lived side by side, one kneeling in church, the other slipping in through the courtyard gate after dark. For centuries, New Orleans has carried a reputation for vice, gambling, drinking, music, dancing, and sex for sale. But prostitution in New Orleans was never just a secret tucked away in a few darkened rooms. It helped shape neighborhoods. It supported saloons, musicians, landlords, pimps, carriage drivers, taxi drivers, and police. It lured tourists. It enraged reformers. It invited federal intervention. And again, the city found a way to profit from it while pretending to despise it. Most people know the name Storyville, the legendary red light district, the Blue Book, the Basin Street mansions, the courtesans, the jazz. But Storyville was not the beginning. Before Storyville, there was Gallatin Street. There was Exchange Alley. There was Sanctity Row. There was Smoky Row. There were dance halls, concert saloons, cribs, and furnished rooms all across the city. After Storyville, the trade did not end. It adapted, it hid, it returned. It survived federal crackdowns, wartime raids, venereal disease campaigns, and the moral panic of 2 world wars. Tonight, we walk through that whole history, from the earliest colonial days to the riverfront underworld, to the jeweled madams of Storyville, to the women dragged into courts and hospitals during World War II, to Norma Wallace, the so-called last madam of New Orleans. This is not the romantic version. This is not the postcard version. This is the long story of prostitution in New Orleans. And like so many stories in this city, it begins in mud. When New Orleans was founded in 1718, it was not yet the city of balconies and gas lamps people imagine today. It was raw, wet, unstable, a colonial foothold in swamp and uncertainty. And from the very beginning, there was a problem that could shape the city's sexual economy for generations. There were too many men and too few women. Colonial Louisiana needed laborers, soldiers, settlers, and families if it hoped to survive. But a settlement crowded with men and lacking women was not a stable colony. So women were brought from Louisiana, from France, some poor, some orphaned, and some viewed as socially expendable. Over time, this history turned into legend. Stories circulated of women taken from prisons, houses of correction, and the streets of Paris and shipped to New Orleans to become wives for the colonists. Some of that story has clearly been exaggerated and broadened over the years. But what remains true is that women arrived in a system where their futures were shaped by state need, male demand, and limited opportunity. A woman in early New Orleans had few paths to independence. Marriage, if it could be secured, domestic work, laundry, informal trade, dependence on a man, or in some cases, sexual exchange as a survival strategy. And that is where the roots began. Not yet organized prostitution, not yet a district, not yet a criminal underworld with names and addresses, but transactional intimacy, sex, shelter, food, security, protection, all beginning to emerge in a city where survival itself was unstable. That mattered because New Orleans was not just a colonial outpost. It was becoming a port, and ports create appetite. They bring sailors, merchants, laborers, and drifters. They create taverns, boarding houses, gambling dens, and transient populations flush with wages and loneliness. They create places where nobody asks your name because nobody expects you to stay. And in cities like that, sex becomes a commodity very quickly. By the early 19th century, New Orleans had become one of the busiest ports in America. Ships moved through, cotton moved through, sugar moved through, money moved through, and men moved through. Sailors came ashore looking for drink, food, company, and release. Laborers and travelers moved in and out of the city with cash in hand and no roots under their feet. Taverns multiplied. Boarding houses took on other functions. Women who needed money learned quickly where the demand lived. And from early on, prostitution in New Orleans was inseparable from everything around it. It was tied to liquor, to music, to rooming houses, to transport, to gambling, to theft, to police corruption. Not every woman in this world was a full-time prostitute. Some moved in and out of the trade. Some worked as barmaids, dancers, waitresses, laundresses, and took clients when needed. Some attached themselves to one man for a season and another after him. Others worked directly from taverns or from rented rooms. The lines were blurry because the city itself was blurry. A poor town does not separate its respectable life and its underworld as neatly as it pretends. And in New Orleans, that underworld soon found one of its most notorious addresses, Gallatin Street. Before Storyville, there was Gallatin Street. Today, it is French Marketplace. Tourists shop there, drink there, wander through without much sense of what's once stood beneath their feet. Built in the 19th century, Gallatin Street was infamous. From roughly the 1840s to the mid-1870s, it was one of the most violent vice districts in New Orleans. Sat close to the riverfront, exactly where sailors and transient men poured into the city. It was lined with gin mills, cheap brothels, sailors' boarding houses, dance halls, and upper-story cribs where women rented rooms nightly or weekly. This was not elegant vice. This was cruel survival. Men came there because it was easy, dangerous, anonymous, and immediate. Women worked there because it offered money in a brutal city that offered many of them few other choices. The cribs were often tiny rooms, carved out of upper floors. A woman might rent one by the night in advance, meaning she had to make enough before dawn to cover rent, food, clothes, liquor, and whatever money was demanded by the men profiting from her. And prostitution on Gallatin Street was rarely just prostitution. It was robbery, pickpocketing, blackmail, violence. A drunk sailor was not simply a client, he was prey. Many of the women working Gallatin Street were remembered as adept thieves. Some lured men upstairs, got them drunker, took their money, watches, rings, knives, or boots, and sent them staggering back into the street. Others fought when they needed to, and few became legends. Bricktop was one of the most feared women of Gallatin Street. She was said to have killed 4 men and stabbed many more. Whether every detail is literally true, her reputation tells us everything we need to know about the district she ruled. Gallatin Street produced women who could not afford softness. Bricktop was remembered not as a fallen woman, but as a dangerous one. America Williams, nearly 6 feet tall according to local accounts, America Williams stood out physically in a district already full of hard people. She was remembered as a brawler, a woman whose size and aggression became part of her power. Delia Swift, also known as Bridget Fury. Even the name sounds like a warning. Delia Swift earned her reputation through violent entanglements, and was remembered as one of Gallatin Street's fiercest women. These were not the silk-draped courtesans of later Storyville myth. They were riverfront survivors. They were women in an economy where sex and force lived in the same room. And Gallatin Street itself reflected the city's first great vice truth. New Orleans would later romanticize prostitution, but the early trade was often savage. This was a place of broken bottles, hidden razors, blood on the stones, and men disappearing in upper rooms they should never have climbed. Still, the district flourished. Why? Because it was profitable. Men wanted it. Landlords rented to it. Taverns fed it. Police tolerated it. And New Orleans, even then, knew how to make money from sin. Gallatin Street was loud, public, obvious. But New Orleans vice did not only live in places like that. It also lived in quieter, more discreet corners of the city, places like Exchange Alley and Sanctity Row, names that now sound almost theatrical in their irony. Because this was the other side of New Orleans prostitution, not the wild dockside underworld, the hidden underworld. This was where respectable men could enter discreetly, where a furnished room could serve two purposes, where a house that looked proper from the outside might host assassinations upstairs, where vice could flourish under a more polished mask. The French Quarter was perfect for this kind of secrecy. Courtyards hid movement, balconies screened faces, passageways swallowed sound. Mixed residential and commercial buildings made it easy for illicit business to blend into ordinary life. This mattered because prostitution in New Orleans was never confined to the obvious underworld. It spread across social classes and neighborhoods. A man who would never be seen on Gallatin Street could still buy sex in a quieter house off a more respectable block. And so, the city developed two parallel vice geographies. The vice everyone talked about, and the vice everyone pretended not to see. That hypocrisy would define everything that came later. Because when New Orleans eventually tried to regulate prostitution through Storyville, it was not really trying to end it, it was trying to move it somewhere else. By the 1870s, another notorious district had emerged in the French Quarter, the 300 block of Burgundy Street between Bienville and Conti. The local press called it Smoky Row. The name evokes the whole atmosphere: cheap tobacco, stale whiskey, dim interiors, loud laughter, hard living, and women the city was happy to use and eager to mock. Smoky Row was associated primarily with Black women in the sex trade. Newspaper descriptions were steeped in contempt. These women were depicted as rough, tobacco-chewing, whiskey-drinking, dangerous, and crude. Men who visited them were often described as being overpowered, robbed, and thrown back into the street. Once again, it is the nicknames that history preserved. One-Eye Sal, Gallus Lou, Kidneyfoot Jenny. Those names survive because sensational journalism liked caricatures. It preserved women as spectacle rather than as people. What we know less about are their origins, their families, their choices, their conditions, whether they had children, whether they were free by law but trapped by economics, whether they entered prostitution by force, by necessity, or by a slow narrowing of options. But we do know this. Smoky Row was part of the same vice economy as the rest of New Orleans. Men spent money there. Local businesses benefited. Property owners profited. Yet the women of Smoky Row bore the harshest contempt from the public. Poor Black women in prostitution were the easiest for the city to ridicule. They had the least protection, the least glamour, the least chance of being romanticized. Police eventually moved in and cleared Smoky Row in 1885, but vice did not end there. It shifted again. And in the same general area as the city changed and nightlife evolved, dance halls would later flourish in what became known as the Tango Belt. By the late 19th century, prostitution in New Orleans was becoming more deeply tied to entertainment. Not hidden now, performed. Concert saloons sprang up along prominent city streets. These establishments offered comic sketches, songs, dancing, rowdy crowds, and drink service. Women worked there as waiter girls or beer jerkers, often in revealing outfits designed to attract attention. Many supplemented their tips by selling sex. In this world, seduction itself became labor. A smile was labor. A song was labor. A dance was labor. Persuading a man to buy another drink was labor. Later, in cabarets and dance halls, women often fell into informal classes. Table girls coaxed men into buying drinks. Dance girls were paid to dance and entertain. Prostitutes sold sex more directly. And the underworld had its own snobbery. Table girls and prostitutes sometimes looked down on dance girls as the lowest rung, even though all of them labored under the same male gaze and economic pressure. One table girl defending her profession after reformers attacked it, describing the humiliation of charming men who treated women like dirt. Her work, she suggested, was a constant negotiation between emotional injury and financial necessity. That testimony matters, because prostitution in New Orleans was not a single neat category. It bled into performance, emotional labor, drink selling, and companionship. Some women moved between categories. Some insisted they were not prostitutes at all, though their income still depended on sexualized male attention. By the 1880s and 1890s, New Orleans had become extraordinarily efficient at selling atmosphere. Not just sex, not just booze, not just music, fantasy. And eventually, the city decided fantasy needed municipal boundaries. In 1897, New Orleans passed the ordinance that would create its most famous vice district. 16 square blocks were officially designated for lewd women to ply their trade. The district lay just outside the French Quarter, bounded by Basin, Robertson, St. Louis, and Custom House, later called Iberville. Because the ordinance was introduced by Alderman Sidney Story, the district acquired the name that history would never forget: Storyville. Story claimed the ordinance had three purposes. First, it would allow the city to tax vice property more honestly. Secondly, it would remove visible temptation from the path of respectable women. Third, it would protect prostitutes from violence and harassment. On paper, this sounded orderly. In practice, it turned prostitution into an even more profitable urban machine. Once vice was legalized inside Storyville, rents exploded. Properties that once rented for modest sums became gold mines. Owners subdivided buildings into tiny rooms and rented them aggressively. This exploitative arrangement became known as jackal landlordism. And one of the most notorious beneficiaries was Ike Herdman, remembered as the miser king of the Tenderloin. He accumulated property in the district and extracted enormous profits from vice rent. So Storyville was never just about regulation. It was about monetization. The city did not bless prostitution morally. It organized it economically. And once that happened, Storyville became not just a district, but a destination. Popular memory often flattens Storyville into one glamorous vision. That is false. Storyville contained both luxury and misery. At the top were grand brothels with parlors, chandeliers, musicians, fine fabrics, extensive liquor, and women whose presentation was part fantasy, part social theater. At the bottom were cribs and cheap rooms where women worked far harsher conditions, charging tiny sums and struggling to keep ahead of rent and debt. A wealthy customer could pay $50 or more for the attention of a high-class courtesan. A poor man might pay 25 cents in a low-end house. This class divide mattered because it shaped everything inside the district. The top houses cultivated elegance. The lower ones sold speed, volume, and survival. And surrounding both ends of the hierarchy was a dense labor network. Laundresses, seamstresses, cooks, bartenders, musicians, doormen, carriage drivers, pimps, landlords, police, and saloon keepers. Storyville was not merely a place where women sold sex. It was an economy all on its own. And within that economy, some women became powerful. If Storyville had a queen, it may well have been Lulu White. Lulu White operated Mahogany Hall, one of the most famous brothels in the district. She understood image, branding, and spectacle. She promoted herself aggressively, cultivated luxury, and turned her establishment into a symbol of high-end Storyville vice. She was associated with diamond jewelry, with elite surroundings, and with marketing that emphasized the racialized fantasies of New Orleans society. Mahogany Hall became known for featuring light-complexioned women of color, part of the city's long exploitative obsession with color hierarchy. But Lulu White was not simply decorative. She was sharp, tough, legally aggressive, and entirely capable of defending her interests. She faced arrest and allegations over the years, including matters involving liquor laws, concealed weapons, and immoral conduct. She lived in a world where a madam needed glamour, but also nerve. And in 1917, when the city tried to segregate Storyville by race, Lulu White became one of the women who fought back. That fact alone should stop anyone from reducing her to a clique. She was not just a madam in silk. She was a strategist. If Lulu White sold brilliance and spectacle, Josie Arlington sold grandeur. Born Mary Anna Dubler in New Orleans, Josie rose from severe poverty to become one of Storyville's wealthiest and most famous madams. She renamed herself after a fashionable resort hotel she admired and used the name to brand her brothel. Her house on Basin Street became one of Storyville's most celebrated establishments, advertised as one of the most decorative sporting palaces in America. Josie Arlington embodied a dangerous fantasy at the heart of the vice economy that prostitution could elevate a woman into wealth and status. For a tiny number of women, it could, but only a tiny number. Most women in prostitution did not become madams. Most did not acquire property. Most did not escape the system with money. Josie Arlington's fame matters precisely because it was exceptional. Her success was real, but it was also rare. Another of Storyville's major figures was Willie Piazza, some called the Countess. She was elegant, prosperous, and deeply significant. Like Lulu White, Willie Piazza occupied the world of Black and mixed-race vice entrepreneurs who built real power inside a deeply racist city. She employed top musicians, ran a successful house, and crucially joined the legal fight against the city's attempt to segregate Storyville. When the city sought to force Black prostitutes into a separate vice district in 1917, Willie Piazza and others challenged the move in court. That legal resistance matters enormously because too often women in prostitution are remembered only as victims or curiosities. Willie Piazza appears instead as a property owner and litigant defending her rights against city power. She was not simply inside the system, she was fighting the system when it tried to strip her of ground she had already held. Best brothels in Storyville had music. This was not decoration, it was part of the business. Customers wanted atmosphere, refinement, and entertainment. Piano players, known as professors, were the district's musical elite. They worked alone, took requests, and often earned excellent money through tips. At the top of this world stood Tony Jackson, widely regarded as one of Storyville's greatest piano entertainers. He had a remarkable repertoire and a beautiful singing voice. Other musicians revered him. Then there was Jelly Roll Martin, who played in many of the district's top houses as a young man and later built part of his myth on those years. And there was Fess Manetta, another gifted musician shaped by the district's demands. Storyville did not invent jazz all by itself. That legend is too simple. But it absolutely helped create an environment where musicians were paid, tested, sharpened, and exposed to constant performance pressure. So prostitution and music in New Orleans were not neighbors. They were collaborators. Among the most haunting images associated with Storyville were the portraits long attributed to Ernest J. Belloc. Belloc was born in 1873 and died in 1949. During his life, he worked mainly as a commercial photographer. The famous Storyville portraits only became widely known after his death, when photographer Lee Freelander acquired a cache of Belloc's glass negatives and later exhibited prints made from them. Those negatives, likely made between 1911 and 1913, show women in the rooms where they lived and worked. Some are clothed, some partially clothed, some nude, some playful, some solemn, some impossible to read. What makes these photographs so powerful is their intimacy. They pull Storyville out of fantasy and into real rooms, beds, curtains, mirrors, wallpapers, bodies, faces. But Belloc's work is also full of uncertainty. Why did he make the photographs? Did the women pose willingly? Did he ever print them himself? How much of their modern meaning comes not from Belloc alone, but from Freelander's later printing and exhibition? Those questions matter, because the women in these portraits are not simply symbols. They are individuals, present, complicated, alive in ways the city larger vice mythology often refuses to allow. Storyville sold spectacle. Belloc gave later generations something closer to present. Storyville was supposed to centralize prostitution. Never truly did. Illegal brothels kept operating across New Orleans because many people preferred them that way. Some owners did not want to pay inflated Storyville rent. Some customers wanted discretion. Many respectable men preferred soft white lamplight in an illegal house to the openly scarlet identity of Storyville. The newspaper complained constantly about these illegal houses. One case involved Mary Pullen, accused of operating a brothel on Elks Place. Neighbors complained, but she was not found guilty, largely because police incompetence undermined the case. Another reoccurring figure was Anna Mother Beer, a widow who allegedly used her furnished rooms to trap and exploit shopgirls. These stories reveal what the city already knew. Storyville did not eliminate prostitution outside the lines. It merely created a profitable official district while allowing the unofficial trade to continue. New Orleans police were deeply entangled with prostitutions. Officers were underpaid, some extorted money from prostitutes, some protected vice in exchange for cash, some looked away, some participated more directly. In 1893, several officers were accused of blackmailing women who failed to pay them. More than 100 prostitutes showed up at City Hall to testify. It was a remarkable scene. Women from across the vice world, some in diamonds, some in rags, standing together against the police. Then there were darker allegations. Under Inspector John Journey, reports described a Pimps and Procurers Club led by Sam Felix, known as the Boss Pimp. Pimps allegedly paid police for protection, and women who resisted the system could be beaten or coerced. This is one of the great truths of New Orleans vice history. The line between law and prostitution was never clean. The city did not stand outside the system. It was the system. Storyville had a mayor. It wasn't in City Hall. It was a name, Tom Anderson. Tom Anderson was not a madam. He was not a politician in title. He was something far more powerful in New Orleans, a broker of vice, money, and protection. Born in the mid-1800s and rising through the city's underworld, Anderson became one of the most influential figures in Storyville's creation and operation. He owned saloons, controlled real estate interests, and built relationships with police, politicians, and vice operators. And when the ordinance passed in 1897, he was ready. Not morally, financially. He ensured that brothels could operate without interference as long as they played by the rules of the system. Those rules weren't written in law books. They were understood. Pay the right people, respect the hierarchy, and stay within the system. In return, Anderson and his network helped secure police raids were selective. Trouble was managed quietly. Violence didn't disrupt profits. The district remained functional. He was the unofficial stabilizer of vice. Anderson's empire wasn't built on one income stream. It was layered. Saloons, real estate, connections to brothels, influence over who could operate and where, and Storyville itself became a financial machine. Land that once rented for a few dollars a month suddenly brought in 10 times that amount. Cribs multiplied, houses subdivided, women paid rent nightly before they even earned a dollar. Anderson didn't need to own everything. He needed to sit at the center of it, and he did. Tom Anderson's real power came from politics. He wasn't just tolerated, he was connected. He helped deliver votes, influence elections, worked closely with city officials who publicly condemned vice but privately understood its economic value. This is one of the great contradictions of New Orleans. The same system that created Storyville also relied on men like Tom Anderson to keep it running. Vice was never outside politics. It was part of it. If Tom Anderson was the king, then the blue books were the guidebook to his kingdom. These small printed directories were sold openly, and inside them, curated map of pleasure. The blue books listed brothels, dresses, madams, description of houses, sometimes description of the women themselves. They were, in essence, catalogs of vice. These weren't crude listings. They were marketing tools. Language was polished. Descriptions were suggestive, not explicit. Houses were categorized by class. A visitor could choose high-end elegance, mid-tier comfort, cheap, fast encounters. Storyville wasn't just a district. It was an experience you could browse. The blue books reveal something deeply important. New Orleans didn't just tolerate prostitution, it sold it. Tourists came to the city specifically to experience Storyville. Men who have nobly met their interests could discreetly purchase a guidebook and navigate the district like a menu. And yet, the same society that consumed these books publicly condemned the woman inside them. Louis Armstrong. Now imagine this world, not through the eyes of a customer, but through the eyes of a child. That child was Louis Armstrong. Armstrong grew up in one of the poorest areas of New Orleans, not far from Storyville. He saw the district not as legend, but as daily life. Women going to work, men drifting in and out, music pouring into the streets at night. Armstrong later recalled delivering coal to the cribs and brothels. And what stayed with him wasn't the sex, it was the sound, he said. I could hear those wonderful jazz musicians playing music the way it should be played. That is Storyville's other legacy. Not just prostitution, but music. Inside those brothels, pianos played for hours, musicians learned to adapt to crowds, competition sharpened skill, improvisation flourished. Jazz wasn't invented in Storyville, but Storyville paid for it. And for the young Louis Armstrong, it helped shape the sound that would change the world. By 1917, Storyville was straining under its own contradictions. Commissioner Harold Newman launched a cleanup campaign. He attacked illegal houses, cracked down on the crib system, and displaced hundreds of women who suddenly found themselves pushed out of work and housing. Some end up begging openly in the streets because respectable neighborhoods would not take them, and Storyville itself had little room left. Then came segregations. City officials proposed forcing Black prostitutes into separate vice districts across Canal Street. Women like Lulu White and Willie Piazza fought back. Their legal challenge ultimately succeeded, and the court struck down the city's racial segregation effort. It was a stunning moment. Black women associated with prostitution had successfully challenged municipal power. But even as they won, a larger force was coming: the federal government war. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, prostitution near military installations became a federal target. Officials feared venereal disease, moral corruption, and weakened military readiness. Storyville, with soldiers and sailors visible, frequenting the district, became a prime target. Mayor Martin Berman resisted closure, arguing that prostitution in a seaport was a necessary evil and safer when contained. Martin Berman, quote, "You can make it illegal, but you can't make it unpopular." But Washington lost its patience. The message became clear: close Storyville or the military would force the issue. And so the city voted to end it. A closure date was set for November 12, 1917. The end of Storyville was not one dramatic explosion. It was slow dimming. Women packed their belongings into carts and wheelbarrows. Some left with everything they owned. The most affluent left with servants, lapdogs, and little luxuries. In one unforgettable image, jazz bands reportedly played "Nearer, My God, to Thee" as the district emptied. The red lights went dark, but prostitution did not disappear. It simply lost its official address. Now let's step out of the brothels onto the streets, because not all women in New Orleans' vice culture stayed hidden. Some walked boldly into the public eye. They were called the baby dolls. The baby dolls emerged in the early 1900s, just before and after the closing of Storyville. They were mostly Black working-class women, many connected to the world of prostitution, entertainment, and street culture. But what they created was something new. Baby dolls dressed in short satin dresses, bloomers, stockings, garters, feathered headpieces laced in bright colors. They exaggerated femininity. They played with sexuality. They turned themselves into spectacle. Mardi Gras, baby dolls took to the streets. They danced, they sang, they teased men, they demanded attention. But more importantly, they controlled the interaction. In a city where women, especially Black women, were policed, judged, and controlled, the baby dolls flipped the script. They became performers, leaders, cultural icons. They were not hidden in rooms. They were visible, loud, unapologetic. Many baby dolls came from the same world as Storyville: sex work, dance halls, cabaret, street performance. But instead of being confined, they transformed that identity into public celebration. The baby dolls still exist today in New Orleans culture. They are remembered not just as performers, but as women who took a system that objectified them and turned it into something expressive, communal, and powerful. Once the erasure of Storyville would happen, we waited some times. And then we come to Miss Norma Wallace. From the late 1930s into the 1960s, Norma Wallace ran one of New Orleans' best-known post-Storyville brothels from 1026 Conti Street in the French Quarter. She was not part of the old legal district. Storyville had long been gone, but she carried its echo. Norma Wallace operated in a city that no longer mapped vice officially, yet still made room for it. Her clientele reportedly include businessmen and politicians. Her house functioned in a New Orleans that wanted prostitution both accessible and deniable. That is what makes Norma Wallace so important. She proved Storyville did not end the city's brothel culture. It merely changed its form. No more official red light district, no more legal vice quarter, but still houses, still clients, still protection, still arrangements. Norma Wallace became known as the last madam because she stood at the edge of an older New Orleans slipping away, a city where vice was still personal, local, secretive, and woven into the social networks that everyone knew existed. Lulu White was the jewel queen of regulated Storyville. Norma Wallet was the quiet queen of its afterlife. So, what is the history of prostitution in New Orleans? It's a history of appetite, labor, race, survival, hypocrisy, music, power, of women navigating a city that repeatedly profited from them while refusing to honor them. It begins in a Connolly desperate for women, hardens on Gallatin Street, hides in Exchange Alley and Sanctity Row. It smokes on Burgundy and Smoky Row. It dances through concert saloons in the Tango Belt. It is mapped and sold in Storyville. It glitters through Lulu White and Josie Arlington. Bites back through Willie Piazza. It lingers in Belloc's portrait. It is crushed in wartime and then returns. And finally, it survives in Norma Wallace's house in the Quarter. Again and again, New Orleans called prostitution a necessary evil. A necessary to whom? Evil for whom? The men who bought sex rarely carried that lasting shame. The landlords who profited from it rarely became the city's enduring centers. The police who extorted, protected, or raided were rarely the ones remembered with contempt. The women were. Bricktop, Bridget Fury, One-Eye Sal, Dallas Lou, Kidneyfoot Jenny, Lulu White, Josie Arlington, Willie Piazza, the women Belloc photographs, the women dragged through wartime courts and hospital wards, Norma Wallace. Some were survivors, some were predators, some were entrepreneurs, some were exploited. Many were all of those things at once. And that is why this history still matters. Because prostitution in New Orleans was never just a side story. It was one of the ways the city revealed itself most honestly. The red lights did just not illuminate vice, they illuminated New Orleans. Thank you for joining me on this most important journey of New Orleans history. This is Tanya, the tour guide. Thank you. Please like, follow, and share this story. Let it get out there. We're loud and proud about it. And also a big shout out to my friend, great musician, Isaiah the artist, for putting it all together for me.